Okay, so really kind of going through DC Rebirth, one of the things I'm going to be doing while we're kind of waiting for a lot of the more recent stories to wrap up is to go back and cover some of the stuff that we just haven't had a chance to do yet. Kind of get caught up on some of the other stories that were left behind, or on things that we simply just, kind of skipped over. For example, we skipped over Action Comics Volume 1. So it's really kind of weird because we messed it up. We goofed. I was so wrapped up with the idea of like who is Clark Kent that we just didn't do the Path of Doom. Like it's Superman versus Doomsday, really Superman and Wonder Woman versus Doomsday. But it's actually kind of a really cool story because it really kind of brings in the idea of Mr. Oz and actually gives us an indication of who he is, which is really sort of interesting here. But the fact remains, with regards to the Path of Doom, this again is really like one of the first major story arcs when classic Superman had come into the New 52. And this is actually the story where he sort of introduces himself to the world. So in terms of the chronology, this actually comes before pretty much everything we've done with regards to Superman Rebirth so far. But the fact remains here, what this does is set the stage for who Lex Luthor is and what Lex Luthor is about. Remember, the New 52 Lex Luthor became a good guy, following the events of Forever Evil. It was kind of DC reforming his character and just simply asking the question, but what if Lex Luthor was not the namesake villain of Superman? What if he was a friend? Like, what if he was an ally? And so they began the process of sort of reforming him, which led us to where we are right now with regards to, Lex Luthor and so on. And so what ends up happening here is, again, this really kind of picks up with the idea of Superman and his family kind of, moving and getting themselves settled in. But then ultimately they're met with the appearance of Lex Luthor donning his own Superman outfit. Because remember, the New 52 Superman had died by this point. And so the idea was that Lex Luthor thought that there should be some kind of successor. And in his mind, he looked at the idea of Superman as his friend and said, I am going to basically live up to the legacy that he created. And so what this does is it brings the classic Superman and the New 52 Lex Luthor directly into conflict with one another. Now, again, this is really kind of cool because from the universe that classic Superman comes from, everything before the New 52, Lex Luthor was a bad guy. And no matter what Lex Luthor did, if he put on the appearance that he was a good guy, it was always a facade. It was always a joke. It was always basically some scheme where he had an ace up his sleeve. And then he would just pull off the entire cloak once it was all said and done and say, this is my grand master plan. Ultimately come out and reveal himself to have been a bad guy the entire time. And so the idea is that this classic Superman does not know the life and times of the New 52 Lex Luthor. He doesn't know what he's about. He doesn't know his history. He doesn't know his past. He just sees a Lex Luthor and says, no matter what universe I'm in, that version of Lex Luthor is always going to be a bad guy. And in this instance, he immediately distrusts Lex Luthor. Now, again, we know the road that this leads to, right? Like we know it eventually leads to a place where the two of them basically become allies. I wouldn't say they trust each other, but it is beginning to move in that direction where, classic Superman isn't really looking at the New 52 Lex Luthor as an inherent bad guy. And so again, it's really kind of cool. Now, the conflict between the two of them is pretty much to be expected. I mean, it's really just like you're a false Superman, you're not the real Superman, that kind of thing. The idea of classic Superman telling Lex Luthor, I know you're a villain, I know your intention is to do bad things. Now, of course, this also comes with the first appearance of Clark Kent, who, of course, we know who he is right now. I'm not going to ruin it for you guys who haven't seen those videos yet, if this is your first one. But again, we have that in the playlist, the whole storyline that runs through all that stuff. So I won't spoil it for you, but it's a pretty cool reveal. The fact remains, what we end up finding out here is that the New 52 Doomsday, the version of Doomsday that we saw facing off against New 52 Superman, is basically having its carcass, transported to a particular location. Now, this is funny because this is DC kind of coming back and saying, look guys, we could have handled the New 52 Superman versus the New 52 Doomsday a little bit better. I mean, it really could have been handled a lot better because that story came out of something where it was part of something called Superman Doomed. And Superman Doomed was actually kind of a twist on the original Death of Superman story. Instead of Doomsday and the New 52 Superman fighting each other and the New 52 Superman being killed by Doomsday, instead what they did is they actually kind of changed it up and they made the New 52 Superman into Doomsday. He was kind of infected with the Doomsday virus, so to speak, and began to metamorph into Doomsday. Now, this was disappointing to a lot of fans because a lot of people had looked at the character of Doomsday and said, okay, this is a legacy character. Whenever Doomsday is introduced into a story, it's only for one purpose, and it's to either kill or severely injure whoever it is that he's fighting against, not for that person to become Doomsday on their own because of some weird, mutation or something like that. And so a lot of people were pretty miffed about how that story ended. And so what this is designed to do is kind of harken back to the idea of the original Death of Superman story. That's the reason why we have this version of Doomsday dressed in this green garb, the way that he looks, is because it's literally supposed to be a harken back to the original Death of Superman story when that version of Doomsday first appeared in DC Comics. So it's really kind of cool to see those things kind of match up against each other. Now keep in mind, this is classic Superman versus New 52 Doomsday. He's never fought this version of Doomsday before. And the coolest thing about this is that all of this is being watched by Mr. Oz. Now, this is the closest that we get in terms of what Mr. Oz looks like, my money is on Mr. Oz being Lex Luthor. That was a really good point that Sal over at Comic Pop had. Sal over at Comic Pop said, Mr. Oz is probably the classic Lex Luthor, the classic villain of Superman who somehow made it into the New 52 or is existing outside of space and time. We don't know where he is, but that's probably Lex Luthor. It looks a lot like him, but there's no guarantee. It could be virtually anybody. We have no real clue who it is at this point. For all we know, it could be Rorschach, who was like resurrected by Dr. Manhattan and Rorschach's a bad guy or something like that. We have no idea, which I'm hoping Rorschach comes back. Love his character. He is amazing. Anyway, the fight between Doomsday, New 52 Doomsday and classic Superman is really intriguing because Lex Luthor does what he can, where he can, but he's got a mechanized suit. His suit is not designed for the purpose of being able to go toe-to-toe with someone as formidable as Doomsday. It takes organic strength and abilities to go against someone like Doomsday because of his size and power and so on and so forth. The other half of this is that the way this New 52 Doomsday was originally done, the way that he was first introduced in Superman Doomed, he was a little more strategic. He was a little more intelligent insofar as Doomsday's not a genius or anything like that. But originally in the classic DC, classic Doomsday was just this mindless fighting beast that just wanted to destroy things and tear things up. The New 52 version of Doomsday was a little more thinking. He was a little more strategic. He would use the environment around him to his own ends. He wouldn't just punch and punch and punch and punch. He would go after those who were close to Superman. He would wage a war on multiple fronts, a psychological war, a physical war. And so, of course, while Lex Luthor is kind of resigned to getting, Clark Kent out of the way and getting, Jimmy Olsen out of the way, the battle between classic Superman and Doomsday is pretty intense. But the other half of this, and one of the reasons why this story is so cool, is because it focuses a lot on Lois Lane and Jonathan. Remember, classic Lois Lane is here alongside classic Superman, and they have their son Jonathan. Now, John does not know about the whole death of Superman event. He doesn't know all that stuff, but Lois remembers that well and good. I mean, she remembers cradling her husband in her arms as he lay dying. She remembers the whole aftermath, all that kind of good stuff. And so in her mind, this seems like just a repeat of the things that have happened before. This seems like a repeat of the fact that her husband is going to be killed by Doomsday. Now, this is why things are so cool, and this is why this story was done so well, because we as the readers sat down and looked at this and said, is it true? Like, is this possible? Could something like this happen? Would we end up seeing classic Superman die yet again? Now, in the back of our mind, in our heart of hearts, we kind of knew that wasn't going to happen just because of the fact that as far as we were concerned, we were like, why would they bring him back just to turn around and kill him in his inaugural story? That'd be kind of weird and it would actually be a little bit weak, but it's still kind of a cool scenario and still kind of a cool situation. And that's really the legacy of the original Death of Superman story living on. Every time Superman fights Doomsday, one of them ain't going to make it out alive. And it usually ended up being Superman. He died at the hands of Doomsday. So again, it's really kind of a cool thing. It's sort of interesting to see all this come together. Now, of course, at this point, we actually end up seeing the introduction of Wonder Woman. And that's one of the coolest things because remember, at this point right now, Wonder Woman is aware of the fact that the New 52 Superman's dead and the classic Superman is here. Like, she's aware of the fact that he's there, that he's trying to be a hero, so on and so forth. She doesn't know the ins and outs and the intricacies of his life, but she does know that he is trying to be a good guy. And so again, by virtue of the two of them basically teaming up, this presents a scenario that we haven't really seen before. I mean, we saw it in the New 52, but we haven't really seen the fight on this scale. We haven't seen an adaptation of the original fight between the original Superman and the original, Doomsday with Wonder Woman thrown into the mix. And that's one of the coolest things here because I feel like DC has done an amazing job really kind of depicting Wonder Woman as this just hardened warrior. I mean, this woman who's both soft and gentle, but she's also gonna like beat the hell out of whoever it is that she's fighting. And it's really kind of cool to see that sort of scenario play out. It's really kind of cool to see these two team up with one another. Now, something to keep in mind is that Wonder Woman's tenure here is pretty short-lived. And the reason why is that while she would be a pretty huge aid on behalf of Superman, one of the things that Superman realizes is that Doomsday can sense Kryptonian DNA. His son John is part Kryptonian, which means that if this version of Doomsday is more strategic than the classic Doomsday that classic Superman fought, then it means that this version of Doomsday would go after his son if for no other reason than to basically, kind of create a distraction, or at the very least to make Superman fight a battle on two fronts, to hold Jonathan hostage, any number of things. But the idea is to basically find his family, get them to a safe place, and then go back and fight Doomsday. And so what ends up happening is Wonder Woman holds off as best she can, and she does a pretty darn good job at it, to be honest, too. I mean, it's pretty cool to see her facing off against Doomsday with her sword and her shield and handling her own just like anybody else could. But the idea here is for classic Superman to basically tell Wonder Woman, get my wife and son to the watchtower of the Justice League, get them out of here and get them to safety. I'll take care of this on my own. Now, of course, he does for the most part. I mean, Wonder Woman gets them out of there, Wonder Woman gets them to safety. But the cool thing about this is a classic Superman Superman recollects on his own battle with the classic Doomsday, and he says, look, the last time when I fought Doomsday from my universe, I died. I went into a healing matrix, yada, yada, yada. Anyway, he's like, basically, for all intents and purposes, it seemed like I died. He practically beat me to death. The idea is to not take that same road. This is compounded by the fact that, again, this version of Doomsday is a little smarter. This version of Doomsday is a little more strategic. And so the idea is to try to find a way to overpower Doomsday while also get Doomsday to make mistakes. And so that's one of the big deals here. That's one of the big interesting concepts. Now, the other half of this are the actions of Mr. Oz. And this is really kind of cool because Mr. Oz actually sends his own guys in for the purpose of capturing Doomsday. Now, again, we don't really get any answers in terms of why he's capturing Doomsday, in terms of why he wants Doomsday, but we know that he is. And that's really the common theme with Mr. Oz. He's very cloak and dagger, very enigmatic. We don't know who he is. We don't know what his goal is. We don't know if he's friend or foe. You know, he's just kind of a guy who's there, and he is wildly mysterious. Hence the reason why there's so much speculation on what's going on with him. Now, of course, the forces of Mr. Oz are overpowered almost immediately, and that's exactly what we would expect. But what this does is it leads to classic Superman leading Doomsday to his fortress of solitude. Now, this is cool because what he does in the middle of all this is he realizes, okay, look, I cannot continue fighting Doomsday forever. That was the first mistake he made. And that's one of the things that he says. He says, look, when I fought Doomsday in my universe, we fought until a standstill. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know what he was capable of. I didn't know what he was about. But there came a point where I realized I could injure him, but by then it was too little too late. But Doomsday is every ounce as powerful as I am, and he will always keep coming back, which means I can fight him forever and he'll always keep coming. We have to find a way or put him in a place that he can't attack anybody. And so the initial intention is to actually confine him to the Phantom Zone. And that is a genius idea. It's one of the coolest ways to deal with Doomsday is to say, okay, fine, well, let's just put him in the Phantom Zone. Let's just put him in a dimension out there somewhere that nobody can ever escape from. And that's exactly what happens here. I mean, he basically attacks Doomsday, hits him with the Phantom Zone projector, and believes to basically whisk Doomsday away. And so the cool thing about this is that while the day seems to be saved, and while this does set the stage for the questions of who is Clark Kent, while it sets the stage for the questions of what will happen with regards to how Lex Luthor and Superman relate to one another, ultimately what we end up finding out is that Doomsday was not whisked away to the Phantom Zone. Instead, Doomsday is basically in stasis, and that he had basically been captured by the forces of Mr. Oz. That in the split second between the time that the Phantom Zone projector was initiated and the time that Superman believed he won, Doomsday was captured and taken away. Now, this begs the question, why? And that's one of the cool things about this, and it's one of the other reasons why I really wanted to kind of cover this story, is because Mr. Oz really kind of closes this out by saying, Doomsday is mine. Now, that begs the question, is Mr. Oz at war with like Dr. Manhattan? Is he creating an army of his own? Because we know at this point, he now has Doomsday. We know that he had Mr. Mxyzptlk. We know that he has Tim Drake. It's almost like he's collecting pieces. He's collecting characters who have been extremely intricate and important to the entire DC landscape over the course of their publication history. And if that's the case, then is he collecting pieces for an army of his own? Do they have a particular role to play? Is there a reason why Mr. Oz kidnapped Tim Drake instead of Dick Grayson or Jason Todd or any of the other members of the Bat family who have all been a huge part of Batman's mythos? These again are kind of the questions that are being cropped up, and it's actually really cool to see in terms of how all this comes together and how it meshes and how it'll eventually lead in to the idea of Superman versus Dr. Manhattan. But with that being said, guys, if you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.